This program is made possible in part by the Maryland Arts Council through the state of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts and the Howard County Arts Council through a grant from Howard County government.
Welcome to Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Joseph Ross, and very glad today to be with poet, author, friend, storyteller, Patricia Smith.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
Glad to be with you.
Thanks.
Glad we're both here. Patricia is the author of 6 books of poetry, including Blood Dazzler, a 2008 National Book Award finalist. She's also on the faculty at City University of New York, on the Cave Canem faculty. She's from New Jersey. She's kind of a wild Celtics fan, actually, and other New England teams. And we're here today at Howard Community College to talk a little bit about, initially at least, about Blood Dazzler. But maybe first off, how'd you come to poetry?
Oh, that's a little bit of a two-layered question. One has more to do with how I unleashed my voice and poetry became possible. Both of my parents came up from the South and settled in Chicago during the Great Migration. My dad brought with him something I like to call the tradition of the back porch, where at the end of the day, he would sit and kind of hold court and turn everything that had happened to him that day into a story. The people at the candy factory where he worked became characters. The people in the neighborhood became characters. And every day, you know, it would be like a serial narrative. You know, I would sit down and say, what happened today? What happened at work today? Yeah. So early on, I mean, I looked forward to those stories more than anything that I was learning or not learning in school. So every day, I thought that life became a series of stories that my father used all of his imagination and sort of melded it with reality, and I was looking forward to it. So I thought, this is the way life is supposed to proceed, you know, a series of stories that, you know, and no reason life can't be entertaining. So I learned to look at the world in terms of the stories that it could tell. Yeah. So that opened up, you know, what else can I do with words? How can I have that kind of sway over a group of people? So I have to be a writer. And so I decided when I was about 8 years old, not sure which way I was going to go, but that was going to be kind of the general thing that I focused on. And then specifically how I came to poetry, I was living in Chicago, and a friend of mine was covering, as a journalist, was covering a poetry festival of 50 poets in a blues club over the course of a winter afternoon. In Chicago. And I said, oh, I'll go with you. And to tell you the truth, the reason we went was we're going to go and drink and laugh at poets. You know, it's in a blues club, there's alcohol, the poets will be funny, they'll be reading things about flowers growing through concrete, this will be great. So we go, and I got there and I started listening, and I realized that poetry was really accessible, that it was about things we talked about, that the language was familiar. People talked about things that were in the news, things that had happened that day, communities I recognized in Chicago. There were, the poetry festival was called Neutral Turf. So it was supposed to bring together young poets and older poets. So you had students and high schoolers reading, but then again, Gwendolyn Brooks was sitting there. And, you know, she stayed there during the whole thing. She would get up and she would read. And I believe that if you say you're impassioned about writing, you should write in as many ways as possible. So here was this whole literary community that in my hometown that I knew nothing about. So I started introducing myself to people and said, where else is this going on? And met some people who took me around to open mics, and immediately I said, it's like a second throat. It's another way to speak. So I thought, this is a community that I want to be embraced by, and I started focusing on that.
And you've been embraced by it, and you've been a gift to it too.
Thank you.
Yeah. And especially I'm intrigued with the idea of these stories that you wanted to tell, beginning on your back porch with your dad telling you those stories. And thinking about Blood Dazzler, which tells this, in some way, a big story of Katrina through the voices of lots of these little sort of smaller stories, not
Sure.
small and significant, small in voice, but very significant. And it's a book that I've loved, and I've told you that. I've given away more copies than I should. So I'm really glad to be able to ask you some questions about it.
Sure.
I feel like it's like this choir of stories. It's an elegy, in some ways for a city, in some ways for how some of us thought about our country before it happened. And I guess writing in all these different voices, the voices of Luther B., the dog's owner, the voice of Katrina herself, lots of different voices. What was easy about that? What was difficult about that? Some of the ways those came forth.
Well, first of all, I'm not not from New Orleans.
Yeah.
I don't have any real connection to the Gulf region. And initially, a lot of people asked me about that. They assumed that, you're someone who comes from there, and this is sort of a love story to your hometown. The role of a storyteller, I think, the primary role is as a witness. And Katrina was not just a regional story.
That's right. Yeah.
It was a national story, and it was a human story. And I love that you mentioned, that you're looking at what your country, all of a sudden you're seeing up close and personal what your country is capable of.
Yeah.
So I watched Katrina unfold the same way, thousands of other people did. The difference is that in my role as witness, in my role as writer, I felt that I could use my writing to process that story. I'm trying to make the story make sense. That's how I approach a lot of stories. It's like, this can't be possible. This can't be true. So let me enter it through my writing and see if I can find something that I'm not seeing on the surface. The thing that was easiest was the voice of Katrina. I found long ago that what we don't do as writers a lot, we don't look for unexpected entry points into the stories we're about to tell. We usually come to the page, some primal emotion is leading us there. We're angry, or we're sad, or we're excited, and we want to write. And we're not thinking about the other hundreds of people, who are also going to their keyboards or to their pads and pencils to write that same story. So persona allows me to enter a story in a way that is going to open up a lot of other avenues to me immediately. So it never occurred to me not to give Katrina a voice, not to have her be personified in the book. And that also lent me some touchstones in the book. I tried to keep it roughly chronological and follow the development of the storm, but every once in a while I'd say, now Katrina is feeling this. Now she's arrogant. Now she's remorseful. Now she's looking and saying, maybe I overdid it. Maybe, So it allowed me to come in and keep her voice alive throughout that story and have her interacting with the people of New Orleans. So that was the easy choice. The hardest one, I think, there's a very cultural, a very textured cultural tapestry in the Gulf region. It's almost as if you're not privy to it unless you're from there. And I think the hardest thing was straddling that line and feeling like, not wanting to feel like I was exploiting that voice in any way. Not to feel like somebody who comes out and says, I am poet and I am qualified to tell you how to, I didn't want to do that. So it was like walking a tightrope the whole time. I wanted to be that witness, but I wanted to save room for the voices that were really capable of commenting on what had gone on. So as the book developed, and it didn't start out to be a book, it started out as one poem. I didn't start out with the idea, I'm going to write a book about Katrina. But as I started to have discussions about the poems, as I started making them parts of my readings, I always wanted there to be question and answer. I always wanted there to be somebody in the audience who was from the region who would engage me or question me or even challenge me on it, because I saw that as being part of the process.
And the voices you use are so varied. I think in some ways that's what, as a book kind of holds it together. But it really unleashes what I think is one of the unique things about your writing. You used the word sort of unexpected, but even down to simple word choices, you'll take us through a line, and all of a sudden there's a description that is brilliant because it's not what we expected exactly. It's the language breaks a little bit, but not breaks bad, but it breaks good or it breaks well, you know.
Well, when I talk about using unexpected entry points, it's not really just am I going to do persona or whose voice am I going to write this poem in, but I think there should constantly be surprises in the language.
Yeah.
You know, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a situation that millions of people have looked at and analyzed and processed, and I'm trying to get you to look at it in a different way. And that not only includes the voice or the point of view that I write from, it includes what can I do to the language to make you think of it differently.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm always looking. One of the things I do in my spare time is I read a lot of children's books because the pretense is not there. We're not working with the same words all of a sudden, and we're not walking up on the stories in the same way. Because children's authors have to do that, but it lets me know that it's okay to tweak the language, and it's okay. Of course, I'm working with the same canvas that everyone else is working with, but I have to bring something new to it every time.
Yeah, yeah, and that you're very good at that. In other books too, I was thinking of one of the lines that that I've loved a lot. Toward the end of 34, you loved me so lush, or I might be mixing it up a little bit, but the idea of being loved lushly, which is not, it's a complete surprise, and yet it works. It exactly works.
Yeah.
Would you read us something from Blood Dazzler?
I will.
Okay.
Let's see. I used to play this game with my students where I just go, give me a page number, and that never worked out. Okay, I will read a poem in Katrina's voice, and then afterwards I have to tell you a little tiny bit about this. 8 a.m. Sunday, August 28, 2005. Katrina becomes a Category 5 storm, the highest possible rating. For days I've been offered blunt slivers of larger promises. Even flesh, my sweet recurring dream, has been tantalizingly dangled before me. I have crammed my mouth with buildings, brushed aside skimpy altars, snapped shut windows to bright shatter with my fingers, and I've warned them, soft, you must not know my name. Could there be other weather, other divas stalking the cringing country with insistent eye? Could there be other rain laced with the slick flick of electric and my own pissed boom? Or could this be it? Finally, my praise day, all my fist at once. Now, officially a bitch, I'm confounded by words. All I've ever been is starving, fluid, and noise. So I huff a huge sulk, thrust out my chest, open wide my solo swallowing eye. You must not know. Scarlet glare fixed on the trembling crescent, I fly. When I started that, Katrina has a little tiny bit of a southern accent, and that developed a long time. But this was also part of a dance theater production in New York, and the woman who danced the role of Katrina, when I read any of the poems now in Katrina's voice, she's what I see. So not only has she been personified in voice, but now she has a body and she has a movement and she has a face.
Interesting.
So it's brought a lot more to the voice when I read the poems.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about that. What was it like to watch that come to life on a stage?
Well, collaboration is tricky because you're working with somebody. I was telling my musicians this, the musicians that I performed with here. Anytime you meet someone with a stark skill, like, they know how to play music, or they, I remember going backstage when we were doing the dance theater thing, and one of the dancers was on the phone, but she had one of her legs over her head while she was talking on the phone. I was like, oh, really? But you tend to come with your poems and go, here are my words, make magic, and the danger is that you're handing over your work and then they can just interpret it however they want. We worked really hard to make it a true collaboration. So when any dancers were added to the production, we went out to lunch. They asked me about specific lines in the poems or how I felt when I wrote things and, you know, where the poems came from, so that when they were dancing, they danced with all that information. And the first time I sat back and watched what they had done, at first it was hard for me to do because I was reading while they were dancing, so I wasn't really seeing everything. I sat back and watched it, and if I could have put life to the words, they did it exactly. They did it. It was one of the most enriching collaborations, and I've worked with blues musicians and filmmakers, and it was one of the most enriching collaborations ever. And one of the things that we're thinking about doing, since the 10th anniversary of Katrina is coming up, we're thinking about, we have to concentrate on the business side, because of course anytime you do something like this, you need money. So we're trying to get it together, and so we can tour with it maybe during that anniversary year. And we were asked to bring it out to a lot of schools and maybe come out to do some arts centers and things like that. But we really want to go down, do an exchange with New Orleans and take the show down there. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, good. But it's hard to believe that 10 years has
Isn't
passed.
It?
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's like it just happened, and the fact that, you know, we're still talking about it.
And it still matters.
Sure.
Absolutely still matters. You mentioned earlier about that part of what's going on in this book and with these poems is poetry of witness, poetry of empathy, kind of a, I don't know, sort of a subgenre of poetry. What's important about that? What matters to you about that?
Well, one of the things that's happening, which I find a little frightening, is I've still been going, I did a lot of reading from Blood Dazzler when it first came out. And then I had another book released, and so, I mean, you know, when the next book comes out, you concentrate on that. And the other one gets pushed back a little bit. But when I go into schools, I make sure that I do things from Blood Dazzler. And now I'm starting to go into schools, and I'll start talking about Katrina, and I'll look at the students' faces and I go, they don't know what I'm talking about. So then I have to backtrack and describe that this is what happened and then do the poems. And that's frightening to me. So I think as long as we can tell these stories, we're basically doing what the history books that go into schools aren't necessarily doing. You know, that maybe 10 years from now somebody can pick up this book and maybe they won't buy it. It'll be in a remainder bin somewhere, and they can look at the back of it and say, "That's right, Katrina happened."
Yeah.
You know, and maybe that's all that we can hope for.
Yeah.
You know, but I think that I was in. This is a really quick aside, but it's going to illustrate it. I think I was in Germany once, and there had been a tour, a poetry tour, where they put poets on a train and they just went through the German countryside, and they would get out and the town square would be all decorated and there'd be music and the poet cheering, and the poets would do something, they get back on the train, go to the next town. So I was in Berlin when the poets came back for the last time, and there were so many people waiting for the poets to get back. I mean, they were carrying flags and signs with the poets' pictures, and that they had to shut the train station down. They opened the door to the train, and they had to pass the poets above people's heads when they, you know,
just like here.
Yeah, just right. So I realized that there are so many places in the world where people do get their news from what the poets tell you.
Yeah.
You get the news from the country or the television, and then you say, okay, let's see what's really happening. Let's listen to the poets.
Yeah.
And it's like that in so many places other than here. But just because people don't receive me that way doesn't mean that I shouldn't be telling those stories.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. And these stories in Blood Dazzler come from, as I've said before, such varied places and from little pieces that would never be told, you know, on the ABC News.
Well, we need to look. That's, of course, people tell you, don't believe everything you see in the news. So when you see those stories, it's really up to you to say, now let's go see what they're not saying.
Yeah. Fill it
You know,
in.
because you're always seeing someone else's truth. You're always seeing what has been honed down into manageable sound bites. and sometimes the idea of walking into those stories and seeing what else is there. And because we live in this society, we don't take the time to do that. So we're letting the news control us, as opposed to let me get to a place where I'm comfortable with what I'm hearing and knowing and believing.
Yeah. Let's move to, you said there's been a book since then, as you say,
Sure.
Shoulda Been Jimi Savannah. And it's I feel like the craft is very similar, but it's very different in that the stories are so personal. It's like you write again in some different voices, but the whole family gets to sing. The whole family gets to speak up.
Sure.
How's that, going to these very personal voices?
I was calling it when I was writing it, and wasn't sure yet what form it was going to take. Really, I was calling it a memoir in verse. I believe that when we first start writing, we write I believe, I see, I know, I feel, and we're kind of doing a surface thing, and that's necessary because we find out where we're rooted. And then we go out and we start commenting on the larger world. But then we come back to ourselves, and we come back to ourselves with a new insight because we've been out there and we've seen it. We are in charge of the telling of our own stories. If we don't do it, and I want to slap so many poets and go, what are you waiting for? If we don't do it, someone else will. And we can't allow anyone else to shape our stories. And so I just decided it's time for me to at least begin writing who I am. So this book, it started out being a book about Motown. It wasn't going to be about me at all. Then I realized the reason I was writing about Motown is because it held such sway over me when I was a kid, and that was reason for that. My parents came up. They were kind of confounded because they had been promised one thing. They got to the city, the realities were very different, and I was left to my own devices a lot. Not in an abusive way, or they didn't abandon me or anything, but they didn't know city lessons. So the music started to teach it to me. So it started like that. So my parents are in here. It's very much about being first generation up north. It's about what that was like. There's issues of city and country. There's issues of race. There's some moments in there that are uncomfortable because they're true. And I don't think it's the be-all and end-all at all. I mean, I think it's just me saying how much of my story am I prepared to tell at this point, but there are other places to go from it, and in terms of it feeling the same way craft-wise, I'm at, or would like to think that I'm at a really exciting juncture where I've studied form and I've studied meter and things like that, but also the aspects of poetry that I got from being in spoken word for so long, that there's a real exciting place for those to come together. And so I think I'm kind of exploring that. That's probably what you see in those two books, and seeing how they can live comfortably together. But Jimi Savannah, I'm happy with that book personally, because to me it indicates a lot of forward movement and my willingness to take very close looks at myself and how I got to where I am. And it's not always a comfortable road to walk, but the fact that I say, yes, I think I can do that. I think I can walk that.
Yeah. Well, you show yourself and you show others, your parents and others around you, in as very human people, which is never perfect. But there's always a real pulse, at least in my reading, there's a real pulse of goodness and a real pulse of hope, wanting to go forward in those poems.
Well, you talk about, my mother is absolutely horrified that I'm a poet.
I was going to ask,
Absolutely horrified.
Families duck.
Right.
Under the covers.
The African-American culture, at least when I was growing up, was a very secretive culture. That's why sometimes you read these stories about people who've had a mentally challenged relative, been living in their basement for years and years, because you don't make those stories public. There's no, there are no mental problems. There's no psychological problems. There's no homosexuality. There's no, that's how I grew up.
Yeah.
So My mother, when she found out, not necessarily, I mean, early books where I wasn't really talking about family to any degree, I might mention them, and the fact that I was mentioning family and saying lines about my family out loud was just horrifying to my mother, because that was blasphemy in a way. So if you look at my mother's bedroom, she has my books on the corner of a very neat little dresser, piled on top of each other, spine uncracked. She won't read them. She won't read them. She won't listen. If I say, "Hi, Mom, I'm in Chicago. I'm come see you. Why are you here?" I come in to do a reading, and you still doing that. The phone will ring, and they'll say, "What?" And she say, "Well, they're hiring at the post office," which to my mother is a
real job.
That's a real job.
Yeah.
9 to 5 benefits.
Stable. Yeah.
Right. And something that's a job to her. So the fact that I'm out and I'm being creative and I don't get paid exactly every Friday, or I don't, she doesn't understand that. So part of the rift between my mother and I is she has never taken the time to understand my passion. So her role in this book, if I could tell her, I would say, "Look, you did bring me here, but it's my job to tell my story, and I can't tell it without you."
Yeah. Yeah.
I just can't do that. So, and I think that's a point that a lot of us reach in our writing, that, we have to be true to ourselves sometimes at the risk of alienating, family and friends. And, and then that's when you have to stop and say, how important is my story to me?
Yeah. Yeah. And then decide to go forward with it.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and your level of commitment, at least to my mind, and I know to the minds of lots of people, has borne great fruit.
Well, thank you very much.
These
Appreciate that.
I think both of these, though very different, are really important books. And your craft and your passion, your avoidance of the post office has kept us...
They're still hiring,
That's what I hear, yeah. I'm glad you didn't go that way. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It's been great to talk to Patricia Smith.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
Thank you. This has been Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Joseph Ross with Patricia Smith. Thank you for joining us.